Once upon a time, there lived a king and queen who were very unhappy because they had no children. But at last, a little daughter was born, and their sorrow turned to joy. All the bells in the land were rung to share the news. The king gave a christening feast so grand that the likes of it had never been known. He invited all the fairies he could find in the kingdom to come to the christening as godmothers. He hoped that each would give the princess a good gift. When the christening was over, the feast came. Before each of the fairies was placed a plate with a spoon, a knife, and a fork, all pure gold. But as the fairies were about to seat themselves at the table, there came into the hall a very dark fairy who had not been invited. She had left the kingdom 50 years before and had not been seen or heard of until this day. Quickly, the king and queen found a place setting for the new guest. But alas, the plate and the silverware were not pure gold. This made the dark fairy very angry. Soon, it was time to give the baby with special wishes. The good fairies wished her well and said, "May she grow to be the most beautiful girl in the world. She will sing sweetly and dance so well. She will live happily." All the fairies blessed the baby and gave her beautiful gifts. When it was the dark fairy's turn, she said, "I declare before all of you," she called out, "that this child on her 18 shall prick her finger on the spindle of a spinning wheel and die." The king and queen were shocked and begged the fairy to forgive them and take her words back, but the fairy refused to do so. When the other fairies saw the king and queen crying, they said, "We cannot undo what the old fairy has spoken, but we certainly can make it different. Your child shall not die when she touches the spindle, but she will fall into a deep sleep for 100 years. Then a prince will come along and wake her up." Hearing this, the king and the queen were relieved. The king forbade everyone from spinning so that the princess would never touch a spindle. The princess grew up to be a kind girl and helped people in need. Everybody loved her. Years passed. When the princess was 18 years old, she wandered about the palace and at last came to a little room at the top of the tower. There, an old woman, so old and almost deaf that she had never heard of the king's command, sat spinning. "What is this? May I try?" she asked. The old lady said, "Of course, my pretty little child." And the princess sat down to spin. But the moment she touched the spindle, she fell to the floor in a deep sleep. The old lady took her back to the palace, and the king and queen laid her on her bed and tucked her in. They were very sad and called the good fairies. The fairies felt sorry for them and cast a spell over the whole kingdom so that when the princess woke up after 100 years, she would not be alone in the palace. Everyone, including the guards, the servants, and the animals, were now fast asleep. For 100 years, they all slept soundly. A 100 years passed. There came a prince from a far-off land He, along with his servants, went deep into the forest and crossed many rivers. Once the prince lost his way and was separated from the rest of the travelers. He came to the sleeping kingdom and was amazed. The guards, servants, and the animals were all asleep and snoring. The prince reached the palace and entered it. All was so still that he could hear his own breathing. At last, he reached the garden full of flowers where the princess was asleep. There she lay, looking so beautiful that he could not take his eyes off her. He bent down and gave her a kiss. At that moment, Sleeping Beauty opened her eyes and smiled up at him. Throughout the castle, everyone and everything woke up and looked at each other with astonished eyes. Within the month, the prince and Sleeping Beauty were married and lived happily all their lives.